AP classes, the AP system has changed the language they have to teach in about every 5 years, which makes it also completely miserable. So, I mean, it's a mess. But I think there's finally a national effort to try and do something about it, and so hopefully we'll make progress there.
My turn? Okay. My name is Marcia Bedard, and I'm a retired women's studies faculty person from the CSU system. I'd like to speak to the issue of getting talented young women into the IT field. One of the informal sorts of surveys that I always conducted with my students at the university was how you got here and how you chose your major. And it turns out that the answers were pretty much the same across the board. Girls who were good at math were told by supportive parents, you can be anything, and that was the end of it. Boys who were good at math were told essentially the same thing, and then immediately following that, an appointment was made with an appropriate professional working in that field, and a connection made immediately to a mentor. In other words, the girls are told, and the fathers are very wanting to support their daughters and thinking that they're supporting them by telling them they can be anything. My take is that that kind of statement is the same as saying you can't be anything. Because saying you can be anything is as good as saying you can be nothing. It's like the anything includes a million things. So how can people follow up and do a better job of helping direct women into the appropriate field?
If you look at, there have been a number of studies of women studying engineering and what caused them to choose to study engineering. And almost 100% of the women either have a father, a brother, an uncle, or some other close relative who's an engineer. And this really highlights what you said, which is if you are connected with somebody who can be a role model and who can give you advice, but who can really make it clear what somebody in a particular discipline you're interested in does, you're much more likely to follow that up. And so, I mean, one of the things all of us can do is we can help make those connections. So, for example, I got an email this morning from a friend of mine who happens to work for Microsoft, but as far as I know, was not involved in getting me on board. And when I first met him, he had 12-year-old twin daughters, and he is a single parent raising them, both of whom were good at math, and one of them who was also particularly interested in art, and I'm a very serious painter, and he didn't have any role models for his daughters, female mathematicians, and who might also be interested in art. And so he asked me if I would have dinner with his daughters, just so that they could be introduced to somebody who had similar interests to them. And of course I said yes, and of course I fell in love with his daughters. And the email I got early this morning was so both of his daughters, this is now 6 years later, both of them applied, early decision to MUD, both of them got in, and the email was, we're taking off in an hour for the airport, and I'll see you tomorrow. But it's the perfect example when you have young women and young men, but especially for young women, they often will not have a role model that they can connect with. So my particular example is that when I was pregnant with my first child, whose birthday we just celebrated yesterday, and he's going to Iceland tomorrow, so we're celebrating a couple of weeks early, but he's going to be 27. I cannot believe that he's so old. But when I was pregnant, I was determined that I was going to continue working full-time as soon as possible after he was born. And the reason I was so determined was that I had the role model of my mother, who had stayed home for 12 years while she had 4 daughters, and the first 2 were planned, and the second 2 were birth control failures. And by staying, and her field was economics, and by staying home for those 12 years, the field of economics changed so dramatically that she never restarted the research part of her career. She was an extraordinary teacher, and so she actually became a tenured faculty member based on her teaching ability, but she could never be promoted to full professor because she never managed to restart her research. And I looked at that and I just went, you know, I'm working at the interface between mathematics and computer science. This field changes monthly. I have to stay working. And everybody said, you'll understand once your child is born that you need to stay home instead. And I did not know a single person who, I mean, forget whether they're in my discipline or whether they're in industry or academia, who'd gone right back to work after they had their first child. And I kept on saying, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And when our son was 2.5 months old, we were visiting the University of Warwick in England, giving lectures, and of course had him with us. And we were staying at the home of another computer scientist who was a good friend of ours. And but we hadn't met his wife before. And when I met his wife, they had 2 kids at that point who were 8 and 5, clearly well-adapted kids. And she'd gone right back to work after she had her first child. And I went, I knew it was possible. See, there's somebody who did it. And I was so relieved, because here I could see that, you know, she had these perfectly healthy, wonderful kids, and she had continued to work throughout. So, you know, I think this bit about making connections for people and exploring possibilities is just really important. So I really frequently meet with young women all over the place. I do phone calls with people I don't even know. You know, but people will say, you know, my daughter is thinking she wants to be a such and such, and she doesn't know anybody who's been a such and such. And if that's somebody that connects to me, then that's somebody I talk to.